Hey, what is up, everybody? Welcome to Real Life. So glad you're here today. If you're outside today or if you're online, join us today. So grateful for you and here in the room as well. Grateful for y'all. My name is Breaux, by the way, and I have the privilege of being on this team around here. And I think I probably need to explain this attire today. This place is a growing church, and there's all kinds of new people coming from everywhere. And honestly, I don't know what you brought in here. And I'm a little nervous about it because I love shaking hands with people. I love hugging people after the service and getting real close to people and praying with people. And I'm just not willing to take the risk. I just want to kind of start playing it a little safer. Now, come on, this is ridiculous, right? Right? A little over the top, perhaps. A little neurotic, even. But man, even though we don't really wear stuff like this, and some of you probably do wear stuff like this if you're working the OR, or maybe you're a painter, or maybe you're a first responder or something. But most of us, we don't ever wear this kind of stuff. But man, while we may not actually wear this stuff, we sure can keep people at a distance, can't we? Now, our political season sure is grabbing all the headlines right now, and it won't take long for things to really start heating up once again. And I've been praying that this time around, we will all be better. Because in this cancel culture in which we currently live, it's so easy to look at people as those people. Those people who don't look like us, dress like us, behave like us, think like us, people who don't vote like us, those people who are not right like we are. And if you and I aren't careful, we can start living with the kind of heart that puts people into the category of the untouchables. My son Derek is a worship leader, and he's a creative arts guy, owns his own construction business these days. He's an awesome husband and dad, one of my very best friends. But most people would describe Derek as a man of few words. But when Derek was a kid, he never shut up. Anybody else have a kid like that? He would say anything to anybody and totally embarrass us. I remember a time when he was in the first grade and he was riding the school bus home. And he tells us when he gets home, Mom and Dad, there are these kids that sit on the school bus close to me and they smell really bad. And Debbie said, "No, Derek, you don't say anything, do you?" He goes, "No, ma'am, I just sit there and hold my nose." He's come a long way since then. And you know what? I think so have I. Because both of us have learned how Jesus moved among people that most people would keep at a distance. I want to show you a story today that's probably in my top 10 in the Bible. It's found in Luke chapter 5, third book of the New Testament section of the Bible. If you got a Bible, you can turn to it. Got an app that you use. We'll also put it on the screen so we can all track along together. And let's just jump in. It says this: while Jesus was in one of the towns, a man came along who was covered with leprosy. Now, only in Luke's account is it detailed covered with leprosy or full of leprosy. Luke was a doctor and he used the medical term for a very advanced form of leprosy. When the man saw Jesus, he fell with his face to the ground and begged him, "Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean." Now, it's kind of cool how this guy acknowledges Jesus' authority right up front. He calls him Lord. He says, "Lord, I believe that you can do anything. Now, you may not heal me the exact way I thought you would. You might not do it right away, but I know you could if you wanted to." It kind of reminds me of how the founders of AA wrote about their experience when they said, "We found that God could and would if he were sought." We found that God both could and would if he were sought. And so many of us have found that to be true in our own lives. And if that's true, to which millions of addicts can attest to, then isn't it also true that God can't and won't if he's not? This guy made the first move. He sought out Jesus saying, "I really believe you could. I just didn't know whether you would." Verse 13, Jesus reached out his hand and touched the man. Now, the word used here for touch is hapto, which means to fasten onto. So this is not some big dramatic, smack in the forehead, be healed kind of thing. Not a big dramatic show with like falling backwards and crescendoing music and stuff. This is just a tender embrace. It is so long since anybody had fastened on to this man. So Jesus fastens onto him and says, I'm willing, be clean. And immediately the leprosy left him. What? Let me read that again. And immediately, the leprosy left him. You've seen those commercials for like plaque psoriasis, people in sleeveless blouses and some guy wearing a Speedo who should not be wearing a Speedo. In fact, nobody needs to be wearing a Speedo. But the announcer comes on and says, many people taking Otesla have found their skin to get noticeably clearer within 6 months of using. And immediately, the leprosy left him. Verse 14, then Jesus ordered him, don't tell anyone, but go show yourself to the priest and offer the sacrifices that Moses commanded for your cleansing as a testimony to them. You see, people would know that this guy had been a leper and they'd be slow to accept him back. But if the priest had inspected him and accepted his offering, it would validate this man in the eyes of the people. Plus, it would show that Jesus had respect for the law. So Jesus instructs this guy after he does the miracle, don't tell anybody. Right. Verse 15, yet the news about him spread all the more. Think the guy might have talked? So that crowds of people came to hear him and to be healed of their sicknesses. But Jesus often withdrew to lonely places, and he prayed. Now, I want to go back and just unpack this a little bit. And I want to look, first of all, at this disease called leprosy. It wasn't acne. It wasn't alopecia. It wasn't a rash. It wasn't even like psoriasis. Leprosy in the first century involved having lethargy and pain in every one of your joints. There were discolored patches of skin all over your body. There were ulcerated sores on your face. It carried a very intense smell, the smell of death, the ulcerating of your vocal cords, and the loss of sensation in all your extremities. It was a terrible, contagious disease that eventually affected the whole body and every major organ. Dr. Paul Brand, who was a leading researcher on leprosy. He died about 20 years ago. Brilliant Christian guy who did research on leprosy treatment in underdeveloped parts of the world. He said the greatest damage he saw of leprosy came from the loss of sensation. Now, I don't want to be graphic, but just so you know what it is we're dealing with here. As these impoverished, homeless lepers would sleep, rats would come and gnaw off the end of a finger. And because the lepers felt no sensation, they would just sleep right through it. And leprosy was not just considered a physical disease, but it also carried a social stigma. Lepers were not just physically quarantined, they were spiritually quarantined. This disease was seen to be a curse from God that announced to the rest of the world, this person is unclean from the inside out as well as the outside in. And not only were they called unclean, they were instructed to shout those words about themselves whenever they got close to crowds. But they seldom got close to crowds because they were quarantined into colonies of like-inflicted people. When they received the news that leprosy had invaded their body, they were immediately taken out of their homes. They lost their spouse, they lost their kids, they lost their jobs, they lost their reputation, their position. They began to lose their hands, their face, and eventually their lives. They carried a disease and a stigma that isolated them socially, physically, and spiritually. Man, you talk about being canceled. And as a result, they were seen and they saw themselves as the untouchables. Mother Teresa, who like Dr. Brand also worked with leprosy in the streets of Calcutta, India, she once said this, we have drugs for people with diseases like leprosy, but the drugs do not treat the main problem. The disease of being unwanted. Feels awful to be seen as untouchable. And if you've ever felt unwanted, you know how horrible that feels. It just sucks the hope out of your life, doesn't it? And that's the way the lepers in Jesus' day felt, totally hopeless. Can you imagine what it's like to be strictly forced to shout unclean about yourself as you walk down the road so that people can avoid you? To walk through your life and see your former neighbors working, to hear your former buddies laughing, to see your kids playing and no longer get to be a part of any of that. To be so alive, but to be like dead. Sue Monk Kidd writes this, it's anguish to come to that place in life where you know all the words, but none of the music. And that must have been the way this guy felt. I mean, you wonder how long it had been since this man had experienced the touch of another person's hand on his hand. When was the last time he had been hugged by a child? When was the last time this guy had been kissed by his wife? When was the last time he'd felt the embrace of a friend? When was the last time he'd even been bumped into? The religious leaders, the Pharisees, the architect of their cancel culture, taught that if you touched an unclean person, then you would be defiled. You would become like them, unclean. So people were to avoid all lepers, and all lepers were to avoid all people, especially religious rabbis. In fact, the strict rule-forcing rabbi was the last person most lepers wanted to see. They knew if they even got close to a rabbi, they'd get busted for breaking the law. And rabbis prided themselves on being so holy, so close to God, that they were unapproachable to any of the marginalized people of the day. And the great irony is this: the only rabbi this leper could approach was God himself. You know, Jesus was the most approachable human being that ever walked this planet. Prostitutes, tax collectors, little kids, brilliant scholars, lawyers, widows, uneducated fishermen, didn't matter. Jesus hung out with them. He was amazingly approachable. And that reputation, it followed him everywhere he went. So this leper, he takes a risk and he approaches Jesus. Now, he knew the law and he makes no attempt to touch Jesus. But he had seen something in this rabbi that made him at least comfortable enough to approach him. And this man, feeling untouchable, unworthy, unclean, falls on his face in the dirt. And in spite of the law of the Pharisees, in spite of this man's contagious condition, in spite of the social implications Mark's account adds, filled with compassion, Jesus reached out his hand and touched the man. I'm willing. Be clean. And immediately the leprosy left him. Now, what's cool to me is that Jesus knew that even before this guy needed to be healed, this guy needed to be touched. I mean, think about this. Jesus, he could have done like drive-through healings, right? He could have stayed in one isolated spot. May I take your order? Thank you. Please pull the next window, please. He could have set up like a headquarters and just sent out healing vibes over a 1,000-mile radius, or social media posts that said, click here to be healed. But he knew the power. He knew the power of a personal touch. I love what Max Lucado writes from the perspective of this leper. He says, I saw him. And before he spoke, I knew that he cared. Somehow I knew that he hated this disease as much, no more, than I hate it. My rage became trust, and my anger became hope. From behind a rock, I watched him descend the hill until I waited until he was only paces from me, and then I stepped out. Unclean, somebody shouted. And I don't blame them, because I was a huddled mass of death. But I scarcely heard them. I scarcely saw them. And their panic I'd seen 1,000 times. His compassion, however, I'd never beheld. Everyone stepped back except for him. He stepped toward me. I said, Lord, you can heal me if you will. Had he healed me with a word, I would have been thrilled. Had he cured me with a prayer, I would have rejoiced. But he touched me. Imagine that. Unworthy of the touch of a man, yet worthy of the touch of God. You know, God wired us up all to be touched. I mean, it's well documented that human beings need to be touched. Now, we all know there's studies that show that people who laugh longer, laugh often, they live longer. And studies also show that people who receive meaningful touch on a regular basis, actually, they have a longer life expectancy as well. My wife, Debbie, is a cuddler and a laugher. So if those studies are true about the health benefits of both, she's going to live to be like 186. I heard about a non-affectionate guy who lived close to where I grew up in Kentucky. He was out with his wife on a date trying to rekindle a little romance, and she steps off a curb and breaks her leg. Well, he calls 911 and says, my wife just fell and broke her leg. We need an ambulance. They said, "Where are you, sir?" He said, "Eucalyptus Street." I said, "Could you spell that?" Why don't I just drag her over to Oak and y'all pick her up there? Now, I'm convinced that we can do a lot better than that. Now, I'm not saying that we all have to be like touchy-feely people, but gang, everyone needs to be touched in some way. Y'all ever go to those little antique shops that are just shelves are packed with little figurines and stuff? I'm telling you, those places, they drive me crazy. Debbie and I went in one the other day, and something happens in me. It's like something snaps on the inside of me. And honestly, I just want to grab a baseball bat and start swinging, just clearing shelves. I can't handle it. On almost every shelf, there are signs that say, "Do not touch, do not touch, do not touch, do not touch." You break it, you bought it. Every day, you and I brush up against people of incredible worth, people who are already broken. And you know what God has done? He's attached a high price tag to everybody that reads, "This person is worth the price of my son." And God goes around putting signs going, "Please touch, please touch, please touch, please touch, please touch." I'm telling you, today there will be someone in your world that will be waiting for somebody to touch them. Will you? Will you extend a hand? Will you put an arm around the shoulder, a warm embrace, an offer of help, an acknowledgement that they're there? My buddy John Ortberg writes, "In a contagious world, we learn to keep our distance. If we get too close to those who are suffering, we might get infected with their pain. It may not be convenient or comfortable, but only when you get close enough to catch their hurt will they be close enough to catch your love." Now again, I love how this leper approached Jesus by faith. He says, I know you can do this. I know you have the power. I just didn't know if you were that kind of God. And Jesus reached out and touched him, not only to heal the man, but to announce to the entire world, God is that kind of God. He wants to be close. Now, I know this verse has meant a lot to many of you. It comes from Psalm 34, verse 18, which says, "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted. He rescues those who are crushed in spirit." And you know why God is so effective with the brokenhearted and crushed in spirit? Because he's close. He is that kind of God. You know, Jesus did a ton of miracles. So many miracles John wrote in his gospel. I don't have room to write them all down. It's crazy, amazing stuff that Jesus did. It would take like a huge library that would fill up the whole world with the amazing things we saw Jesus do. But when Jesus did these miracles, he didn't do them to show off. He wasn't trying to build a big crowd. He wasn't trying to go viral. In fact, he told this guy and other people at other times, "Please, let's just keep this quiet." Because he knew the chaos that would occur, what tension and opposition would mount with the constantly scheming religious leaders who hated him. But Jesus healed people. He touched people because he could and he wanted to. Now here's the whole deal though. Healing their body was not the ultimate goal. And he didn't choose to heal everyone. And if physical healing was the goal, then none of them that he did heal would have died. But they all eventually died. Even his buddy Lazarus, he died twice. Jesus' response to suffering people and to the untouchables was to provide an up-close and personal glimpse into the heart of God. I like what Philip Yancey writes. He says, "By no means did Jesus eliminate all suffering. He healed only a few in one small patch of the globe, but he did answer the question of whether God cares. Regardless of how the world treats them, the poor and the sick have assurance because of Jesus that God knows no undesirables. There is hope for everyone." What a feeling to know that you are wanted, that you're not undesirable, that you're not unwanted, that you're not unclean, you're not untouchable. I'm telling you, when you discover that, it's hard to keep that quiet. You see, nobody ever touched a leper. If you touched one, you got infected. But when Jesus touched the leper, he did not infect Jesus with his disease. Jesus infected him with his life. And as a result, this guy was really contagious now. Remember how Jesus told him, "Don't tell anybody. Let's keep this under wraps." His ministry didn't need any more attention, hassle, or crowds. But this guy simply could not stay quiet. It says this over in Mark's account. Instead, he went out and began to talk freely, spreading the news. As a result, Jesus could no longer enter a town openly, but stayed outside in lonely places. Yet the people still came to him from everywhere. I mean, come on. Can you blame the guy? I mean, how do you keep something like that under wraps? How do you keep that? I once was lost, but now I'm found, was blind, but now I see. I was in darkness, but now I'm in light. I was rejected, but now I'm accepted. How do you keep that kind of experience quiet? You just can't. Something like that happens to you, you want to explode with gratitude. It's hard to shut up about it. You know, this is a growing church. And part of the reason is because we just can't keep quiet about how the love of God has changed and is changing us. You might be sitting in a row right now with a family that just a few years ago was absolutely falling apart. But they allowed God to get close. And he reached down and he touched them. You may be sitting really close to someone who was adrift in a deep, deep sea of depression and grief, but God touched them, pulled them out. You may be just a few seats away from somebody who wrestled big time with alcoholism, drug addiction, an eating disorder, but like the leper, they came to Jesus and said, Lord, I'm willing. You willing? And they found that God could and would if he were sought, and they started seeking his help, and they got into a recovery group, and he began transforming their lives. You are in the same room with people right now who are terminally ill, who are finding another kind of healing, an unexplainable peace and strength to move through every day of their life because the God who draws close has given them an eternal hope that will not disappoint. You're in the same room with people who had a horrible reputation, who had a wild sexual past, those who did prison time, those who thought forgiveness was not available for them, but they found out they were dead wrong about what kind of God God is, and they felt the life-giving touch of Jesus Christ. I'm telling you, when that happens to you, man, it's hard to keep that quiet. Once you get infected by Jesus' healing touch, you move through your school, your workplace, your neighborhood, your own home with contagious joy that just flows from a place of deep gratitude. I'm not talking about some obnoxious religious fervor, but rather this attractive peace, a healthy confidence, a humble heart that's just full of compassion that touches those around you. When God has changed your life, when Jesus has infected you, man, it's hard to keep that quiet. It's hard not to want to touch the world the way you have been touched by God. I met Eddie after church one weekend. He came with his brother asking for prayer. It was only his third time ever in a church, and he wasn't sure he believed any of it. His brother and his sister-in-law had been inviting him to come for years, but he would, stiff-arm him every single time. He was a pretty self-centered guy. He was chasing lots of stuff. But something had changed in his life. He was diagnosed with cancer, and there wasn't much hope. So he finally came with them, and God started softening his heart. And he reluctantly walked up front with his brother and asked for prayer. And we talked for quite a while. We hit it off right away like we were old friends. And I told him that Jesus was a healer. And even though he doesn't always choose to heal people physically, that there is a deeper healing that Jesus brings. And I told him in my life how Jesus had healed me from an addiction to self and approval. And I told him that Jesus had replaced my greed with gratitude and my envy with contentment and my anxiety with peace. And so we huddled up and we prayed. And we stayed in contact with each other. Well, a few weeks later, his brother texted me. And he asked if the three of us could meet for lunch. And we sat there. I'll never forget it. We're sitting at this round table. I'm right across from Eddie. And he gets real choked up. He said, I want to give you an update on my cancer. My doctor said he'd never seen this, but my cancer is completely gone. And I can still remember looking across that table and just saying the first thing that came out of my mouth. I don't know why I said it other than the Holy Spirit put it in my mouth. I said, man, So what are you going to do with a gift like that? He goes, I don't know. I didn't think of it that way. Well, he took those words to heart. He ends up giving his life to Jesus. I got to baptize him. And he was already a likable guy. But this dude turned into a love machine. He began to walk with humility, asking for forgiveness from friends and family. He became good friends with his ex-wife and her new husband. He started being the kind of dad his girls had always needed him to be. It was like that old Tim McGraw song, Live Like You Were Dying, except he wasn't skydiving or Rocky Mountain climbing or going 8.7 seconds on a bull named Fu Manchu. He started serving and giving himself away. He got infected by the touch of Jesus Christ. And he became this super generous, contagious guy who in turn touched a bunch of people. I mean, he was bringing coworkers and clients, his girls to church with him every weekend. This guy was a light. Well, just short of a year later, the cancer came back. And this time with an aggressive vengeance. And he lasted only a month or so. And I can remember being at his bedside while he was out. I was guessing that he could hear me and understand me, so I told him how honored I was to be his friend, how honored I was to be in the family of God with him, how proud I was of the way he lived his life. And I kissed him on the forehead, first dude I ever kissed on the forehead in my life, and I told him I'd see him very soon. Well, just days later, I got to do his funeral, or rather the celebration of life service. And it was incredible how many people were there. The chapel that we had it in held like 1,500 people. And people were standing across the back and down the sides and sitting outside the doors in the lobby. There's so many people there. And so many people got up and told stories of the way that he had touched their lives. And we all cried and we laughed and we worshiped God. I'm telling you, it was so moving. He had his brother make DVDs of a message that I had preached that meant a lot to him, and he wanted everybody to get one on their way out. But Eddie took that gift of healing, and he let Jesus heal him where it really matters. And he began to touch people with the love that he had received. I've had this quote from Ian Watson hanging over my office desk for many years now. He writes, "We live on a contaminated planet. It is contaminated on every level. It should have been quarantined from heaven. No reasonable God would go near it with a 10-foot pole. But Jesus is no reasonable God. He became a human being and took on your uncleanness and mine. But instead of the world infecting him, he infected the world. And with his immaculate infection, it's still spreading." You know, today, if you need prayer for healing, for any kind, you got anything going on in your life these days, we will have people down front who would love to pray with you. I'm telling you, Jesus wants to touch you. He wants to bring healing to your soul. And I just want to encourage all of us today, when we leave this place, or maybe even while we're still here, there will be people waiting for somebody to touch them. So why don't we take off the safety glasses and start to see with new eyes and look at people the way Jesus did and be sensitive to the people that God puts in our path this week. Let's take off the gloves and let's touch the world with the healing love of Jesus Christ. Let's pray together. Father, I'm just so grateful for the way you've touched my life and touched the lives of so many people in this place. And I pray for anybody here today, anybody listening online, that just needs a touch from you, that they would seek you like that leper did and say, Lord, I know you can. I was just wondering if you would. And Father, I pray that today someone would experience what kind of God you are, the God who pulls up close and puts his hands on us and embraces us and welcomes us into his family. Father, that's my prayer today. And I pray that you would use all of us to touch this world with the infectious love of Jesus. And I pray it in his name. Amen. Hey, this is my last weekend in role of interim lead pastor. And I'm just going to slide back into my old role. And I just want to thank you for the way that you have continued to be the church and you've continued to be the hands of Jesus for these past 8 months or so. It has been inspiring to watch God move through you. And we have the most amazing team of men and women who just work tirelessly and joyfully. They are motivated by their love for Jesus and you, and they have been nothing short of awesome during this entire transition. So next weekend, Jake Barker starts, and y'all got to be here. You got to invite friends and neighbors, and let's just pack this place out and let's welcome him and his family. God is moving here, and let's continue to join him in what he's doing because, gang, it's all about Jesus. So why don't we stand right now and let's just worship him with all that we got.